the 2018 Commonwealth Innovation Forum, brought to you by Destination Gold Coast.
So we're going to end today, before those drinks and nibbles, looking at how we've been changing. And technology, you and I both know, is a serious disruptor, not only in journalism, in Airbnb, in the Uber industry. How are our industries being reshaped? How is this changing the way we work and indeed how our economies run? Thanks to our sponsor here, the Queensland University of Technology. Ladies and gentlemen, from the CSIRO, please welcome our moderator for this session, Dr. Peter Riddles. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Donna, thank you so much for the introduction and for the awesome effort you put in over the last 2 days in emceeing the conference. Before I start, I actually would like to acknowledge the efforts that LSQ and Mario Panisi's team have put together to bring this conference together and all these wonderful speakers. And it made me, because I've sat through all the presentations, it made me reflect, in fact, we're the last panel, and it made me reflect about how and what we might emphasise in our discussions. And I particularly thought about two particular presentations I've been to over the last 2 days. One was last night by Penelope Wensley, the former Governor of Queensland, on the Great Barrier Reef. I thought that was an awesome speech which really brought home the issue and the impact of a variety of things on something so vital and valuable to our economy and environment. And the second thing was the plenary given by Matthew Ames. And I think that made us all appreciate why we're actually working in this game of science, technology and innovation. And to me, that represented two opportunities and two challenges. One was this massive environmental challenge, and the other was a personal human medical challenge. And that's why we're here. And then it made me think about, well, what is the role of industry in all that? Because it's not the only component in the innovation system. But traditionally, industry has been involved in actually making, selling the products and services that can go, to solve environmental problems or medical problems. And of course, the way industry gets together now is also evolving as new technologies enable new governance models and new business models. So in order to set the scene, I'm going to introduce the panel in a minute. I would like to share a quote with you from the foreword of a book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution, and some of you may have read it, by Klaus Schwab. And I'm just going to read the quote because it actually very nicely sets the scene for what we're going to discuss this afternoon. He said, "Previous industrial revolutions liberated humankind from animal power, made mass production possible, and brought digital capabilities to billions of people on the planet. This fourth industrial revolution is, however, fundamentally different. It is characterised by a range of new technologies that are fusing the physical, the digital, and indeed the biological worlds. It's impacting all disciplines, economies and industries, and even challenging ideas about what it means to be human." So we're going to endeavour to take you on a journey in this last session and maybe address all of those points. I'm going to seek your input. It is late in the day, and after this we can do the networking and the farewell. So I'm going to ask for you to be as proactive as you feel like with the panel and make it a truly informative and instructive session this afternoon. So without further ado, I will now introduce the panel and ask them to come on stage as I call their name. Firstly, there's Professor Tony Burkett, who is with Bionic Vision Australia.
Thank you.
Welcome, Tony. I must say we have an apology from Melissa Kaplan, who unfortunately was taken quite ill in the last few days. We then have Leanne Kemp, who is with a company called Everledger, and we'll hear more about that today. Welcome, Leanne. Dr. Fayez Kazi, who is with a company called Precision Biosciences. Welcome, Fayez. Jean-Christophe Longchamp with a company called Better by Sport, which indeed is based in Bern and Australia. Welcome, Chris. We also have a potential apology from another panellist, Ian Mason with Virgin Startup. We've arranged that we understand he's held up, but if he shows up, we will rapidly incorporate him into the panel. And finally, I'd like to introduce Professor Arun Sharma, who is with the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. So I'm now going to join the panel, and to start off with, I'm going to ask the panel to reflect on their own life story, their own journey to this point, to this panel today, and get you to contemplate what your personal vision is in this general heading of future industries. So, in fact, I might start with you, Tony. Please colour it with your own personal history, but also keep an eye on that vision and where you think we're going with future industries.
Certainly, thank you. As I said, I've had the great privilege of being the director of the research program called Bionic Vision Australia for the last 8 years, which has been developing implants, retinal implants for people with profound vision loss. This is built upon the advances that have been made in Australia with the cochlear implant, so adapting a lot of that technology to be suitable for people with these retinal-degenerative diseases like retinitis pigmentosa and eventually for age-related macular degeneration. So this is for people who are at the have very advanced form of vision loss. But I also work in a department of biomedical engineering where we're developing a whole range of assistive and rehabilitative technologies. And from my perspective, this is really a wonderful time in which we're living, because there are so many new opportunities becoming available through these technologies, through new materials, through new ways of being able to interact with the body, to be able to help people who have profound disabilities and improve their quality of life and what they're actually capable of doing and to reach their own potential. So I have a very optimistic view of where this technology is going into the future. I've seen enormous advances even over this last 10 years in which I've been involved with the retinal implant program, and before that 10 years with the cochlear implant program, to see the enormous changes that have happened for the patients who have been using this technology. It really has, in the case of cochlear implants, enabled children who are born deaf now to be able to take part in normal schooling and essentially to have the sort of life opportunities that the rest of us just take for granted. I can see that this will continue into the future and that this technology really, we're only at the start of this. And I can imagine we're working on programs to help people with things like epilepsy, brain-machine interfaces, and a whole range of assistive technologies. So I think it's a very optimistic future that we're looking forward to.
Great, Tony. Thanks for that. They're very good comments. We're going to shift gears slightly. Leanne, what's your personal journey and what's your vision?
My life story.
What's your vision for
long
the
walks
industry?
on the beach,
Yep.
Yellow roses and great French champagne. But no,
I thought diamonds was in there somewhere.
Diamonds are definitely in there. So my name's Leanne Kemp. I'm the founder and CEO of Everledger. I'm a Brisbane girl, so I'm glad to be home. I began in the heart of London in April 2015. We looked at the emerging technology stack. How can we bring together the very best of blockchain, smart contracts, machine vision, cognitive, and how can we apply that to opaque supply chains? How can we bring transparency to those that might want to have hidden commercial secrets? So we began in 2015 and we looked at how we could take the identity of a diamond, transform that into a digital twin, and enable the tracking of that diamond from the source of the mine right the way to the market. And as we wind forward today, we're 3 years old. We have 2.2 million diamonds that have transcended that journey. And we are able to now proudly show that the journey of a diamond is able to be tracked and traced. And as we start to look towards the future, we start to question ourselves, what other supply chains require an ethical trade platform? What else is happening in the world beyond gemstones? What's happening in metals and minerals? And so as we start to look towards 2020, we begin to expand the baseline of our work in diamonds and begin to look at those more challenging supply chains. For example, batteries. Batteries, of course, with stored energy is probably one of the most significant and most profound supply chains that will impact the world, because there's not a person on the planet that doesn't rely upon it to ensure the powering of their mobile phone. In some countries of the world, we require it to ensure that there is power within our homes. And of course, there is probably not a government in the world that isn't considering what it means for stored and ethical energy. So there you go.
Supply chains.
Correct.
Yes. We're going to come back to blockchain. We're going to talk about its impact on society. And I think there's been already a lot of interest in this in our lead up to this panel. So thanks, Leanne, for those comments. So I'd like to go now to Chris Longchamp. Chris, you've got diverse background across nations and have worked globally indeed. So what's your vision? Where are we going with industries of the future, and what's your contributions to the journey so far?
Right. I believe that convergence is going to be observed across the board, convergence of domains, intersections. And one of the convergences that we're looking at is the one between sport and health, actually. And I guess, having the Commonwealth Games at the moment in the Gold Coast, is a perfect moment to acknowledge that neither sport nor health sectors have necessarily come together in a productive fashion, in a innovative fashion to address the huge opportunity for preventative health. This is what Better by Sport is aiming at doing, is really highlighting the opportunity, number one. Number two, making sure that we don't necessarily think too complex, but we use the existing digital technologies available. And with that, start prototyping and delivering solutions to humans so that they can improve and understand more about their body. So it'll be a long conversation to tell you how we do it, but essentially, if you think about basic sensors available in your iPhone or your smartphone, that consists of a global positioning system, an altimeter, and a podometer. With that, combo, you can basically do what we call a fusion of those sensors and measure your intensity while you are actually moving. And while you are moving, you're exercising, you're training, with that intensity, which essentially is a mechanical power or intensity, we translate these numbers, if you want, into bioenergetics numbers. And basically with algorithms that get us to the technology really that is already, it's not even the future, it's already part of what we do. Every one of us here know about algorithms. And with algorithms, we translate these bioenergetics adaptations, which in turn will give you clues about your improvement or your decline, or whatever sluggish state of your training. So that's where I see the future is really in convergence. It is certainly also a data world where, and I guess the element of blockchain that we're going to probably discuss and others come into play, where you cannot address human-centered issues by not addressing security and addressing how you actually flow that data from one point to another. And I think human-centered services are highly dependent on how we humans design the boundaries of the services.
Thanks, Chris. We'll come back to the issue of convergence because it's self-evident now that not only are scientific disciplines and technologies converging, but it's leading to industries converging and using different technologies to make different products. So it's a very important concept, I think. Faiz, you're the biologist on the team. Your company Precision is using recently developed technologies like gene editing technologies to produce all sorts of products that are going to benefit both agriculture and human health. What's the journey for you so far, and where are you going, and what's the future hold in terms of future industries?
Absolutely. I'm a molecular biologist by training and translational biologist by practice. So my journey has been essentially towards taking data and converting that into information to knowledge to innovation. So in that journey, what has been the commonality is that there is a good amount of information knowledge that already exists. What doesn't exist are these connectors between these siloed information systems. What we are trying to do at Precision Biosciences, and I lead the Precision Plant Sciences effort as the president of the company. One of the things that we are trying to do is bring those silos together from a multi-scale biology approach, meaning you learn, because if you truly look at a human therapeutic system, in human therapeutic systems, it's one species. In plants, there are 130 species that are relevant to somebody on the planet. So the question then becomes, how do you learn from one species, put that to use in another species rapidly? So one of the things that we are doing at Precision Biosciences is our flagship technology is a genome editing technology. And genome editing technology, for the purpose of genome editing, is not going to solve the complexities involved in agriculture. So our effort is, we take this flagship technology and surround it with all the complementary technologies, and then partner with subject matter experts and experts in the field to expedite innovation. So with the final goal of influencing human health and human wellness through food, as opposed to, food is something that we eat every day, whether you're a sick person or a healthy person, doesn't matter. But what you eat and how you live will basically depend on what is grown by the farmers and what comes in through the supply chain. So what we are trying to do as a life systems company, we want to take technology to influence the entire supply chain with humans as our final destination for the technology.
Yeah. Thanks, Faiz. We'll come back to converging industries too, because you had some very good information on your website about this, so we'll pick up on that. Arun, you've got a long history in science and technology, and I know that you're involved in the early days of NICTA, and it's had a journey, and it still exists in another form. Could you give us your views then on the role of technology, particularly with these future industries, and your own personal experiences along this journey, and particularly looking at the future of digital?
So I'm a computer scientist, and I seem to have been involved in almost everything to do with computer science in Australia. I used to be the head of School of Computer Science and Engineering at University of New South Wales 15 years ago. And I used to teach machine learning in the early 90s when it wasn't fashionable. So my background is AI. And we helped set up the CRC for Smart Internet Technology, and then I was the co-founder of NICTA, which now lives as Data61. In some ways, if I look at my career, it's pre-2004, which was largely to do with computer science. And I haven't done much with computer science except to take a deep dive in blockchain 2 years ago. And we'll come to that, but we have the authority on blockchain here and its applications. But my journey at QUT actually has been about looking at the information and communication technologies and developing an understanding of the other areas that are helping create the fourth industrial revolution. So I've got to be involved in more material science, help build capabilities around 3D printing and additive manufacturing research, what the issues there are, and how those are converging with ICT, and we can pick that up as an example later. And also, at the same time, the life sciences and the animal world. QUT is one of the places in the world that uniquely is able to undertake research under strictest of conditions on testing implants, new materials, and devices like artificial heart in sheep and pig at the Prince Charles Hospital. So in some way, and I had a discussion with the director for the Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution, and we explained to him, he said that QUT actually is the university for this fourth industrial revolution, because we do computer science, we do material science, and we do life science, and we are trying to make them to converge. But the other part of my education has been, as a Deputy Vice Chancellor Research, I actually happen to be the longest serving Deputy Vice Chancellor Research in Australia's history.
Congratulations.
What it makes you do is you actually get to understand that it's not always the scientists and technologists that want attention. The business professors want attention, the law professors want attention, people who work in behavioral economics to change people's behavior and influence politicians need attention, and you try to understand what is driving them. And the biggest threat that the world is facing is this fourth industrial revolution, as transforming as it is, also has the potential to create some of the greatest inequality on the planet. And we have to undertake deep study around the governance of these technologies that do bring in the business models, that do bring in the regulatory framework, that do bring in behavioral economics and social change, and how we influence the governance. That, I think, is the greatest challenge. And I think, if I sum it up, this is what I'm passionate about.
Thanks, Arun. It's good to have a passion. I think all of us in this room have a particular passion, and that's why we're here. We're going to talk about convergence in a minute, but before we do, I want to come back to blockchain. So I'm a biologist, Leanne, but I've put in a big effort to do MOOC courses and things and understand things like blockchain and AI and so on. I'm wondering if you could give the elevator pitch on how blockchain works and what it does. And then I'm going to come back to Arun, because we had a conversation before we came in here about its potential for influence and how powerful a technology is. So, Leanne, tell us what it does and how it works and why it's so important.
So blockchain is the perfect example of convergence. Blockchain is a combination technology. It's taken together the very best of cryptography in terms of security mechanisms and protocols. It's combined next generation database technology, so the storage of data in a distributed form, and it's combined that together with consensus mechanisms, whether that be federated or under a proof of work or a proof of stake. So blockchain, if you were to strip it back to its most potent formulas, it does reside on those three sets of primitives, to say the least. And when you really sort of consider the evolution of the internet from the mid-90s to where it sits today, the internet certainly wasn't designed to enable the identity of a third party at the other end of a transaction. In fact, the internet was really a glorified sharing of information like an encyclopedia or a billboard, and hence why we've seen marketplaces that have emerged or companies like Google have emerged out of the sharing of advertising or the sharing of files and data. But certainly now, when you really think about it, and we wind forward to today, the internet, as we know it, is the fundamental economic instrument of our time. You know, there's not a person on the planet that largely doesn't depend upon it or needs to depend upon it for human equality. There isn't a government in the world, of course, that doesn't transact across it. Yet the internet, at its very foundation, hasn't really been wired for trust. And we saw what that means when we face an implosion of trust or a distrust, whether that be the global financial crisis in 2007, or we're now starting to see headlines from Equifax through to Cambridge Analytics about the concerns that we have in data and data sharing. So, blockchain was pretty much a hidden secret that sat beneath the engine or the mechanisms of cryptocurrency, and who would have thought that Bitcoin, in all of its fashion, probably untapped itself in terms of saying this is the next generation technology for the internet. So given that, if we think about it in that paradigm, the place that we sit today in terms of blockchain, of course, is a pretty sexy industry to be in, if I must say so myself. But the reality is, within the next 2 to 3 years, maybe even 5 years, we won't be talking about blockchain. Because the reality is, as the internet was first discovered in the mid-90s, within a very quick period of time, we were no longer talking about HTTP or SMTP. And we were talking about, maybe for the first generation of the internet, we were talking about browsers and Netscape and what have you. And maybe we were talking about what was built on top of SMTP, which was email. But now, of course, we're not even talking about that. You know, we're talking about applications and marketplaces and what have you. So we're in this evolution of communications and trust-based technologies. So where does it sit? It sits as an engine that drives cryptocurrency and peer-to-peer exchange of value. And now that could be in a monetary form across cross-border transactions, looking at sort of, you know, central authority and banking, correspondent banking. These are sorts of industries that may be not necessarily disrupted by this technology, but certainly potentially interrupted for a certain period of time, where they rethink the value that they're bringing to the universe. As Everledger, we looked at this not from a banking or a financial services perspective. We looked at it from a non-financial application sense. And how can we use this technology in a way to serve a greater purpose of transparency, and where could that best be fit? And of course, my background for the last 10 years has been in the diamond and jewellery industry. So of course, it served very well for me to start there. So just as Amazon started with books, we started with diamonds. But we are seeing applications in the space of pharmaceutical, baby formula. How can we track that in terms of its authenticity? And then of course, we're seeing it in medical science. I mean, there's a big genome project that's actually being mapped now around mapping the genome of flora and fauna in the Amazon, and how can we have these protected DNA at a level where this digital rights is actually a global commons. So from a global commons perspective, and I'm an appoint with the World Economic Forum, so I'm very close to the fourth industrial revolution. I sit on the Futures Council for Blockchain with the World Economic Forum, and more recently was asked to join and form the vision for 2030 for the world. Just a small task. So thanks, Klaus, for tapping me on the shoulder for that one. But more importantly, what does this mean from a global commons perspective? And the global commons has typically been looked at as the quality of the air we breathe, the oceans, deforestation, etc. But I was looking at it from a different angle, and I said, hang on a minute, we actually have technical global commons, and maybe we should define what they are. Given that the internet is a fundamental economic instrument, HTTP, SMTP, blockchain, these are all effective global commons. From a digital perspective, if we don't preserve those, if we don't have a consciousness around the ethical enablement of AI, then this is a very, very big problem. We face the same criticality in the air, in the quality of the air we breathe, as to the quality of the data that we're exchanging. So this is I don't really practice Sudoku, but sort of I have a look at that sort of part of my world.
So at this point, I want to encourage all the panel members to, if you have a thought, and join the conversation, as well as the audience. Please raise your hand and ask a question or make a comment.
I'll just say something, just interject a little bit on the user friendliness of things. You know, if put ourselves in the shoes of the consumer. As technologies, evolve and present it to them, right? Or like you said, they might be implicit actually, not necessarily exposed directly, but they're part of the infrastructure, right? Remember, when internet came and was delivered, to the consumers, still a few years down the road, it was tricky to set up your router.
Of course, yeah.
Right? And I think that's what we need to reflect on. It's a bit of an analogy I'm making here on anything that we've done wrong in the past and we could do right in the future. So I'm trying to make a shortcut, right? But in other words, if we can make things much easier to the consumers, they'll change behavior more easily. They'll adopt technologies. They won't be afraid of technologies anymore. I think that we have a gap. We still have a gap, and it's here to stay for a while, and I think we need to resolve it.
Look, I think it's a good point. So, I mean, I've often sort of likened blockchain. It's a very nascent technology, and it's no different to, and I've been in this technology form now since sort of late 2013, early 2014. So one could consider that's ahead of its time. But I likened it to a child being born. In 2013, this was a newborn child. This technology was really awkward. I mean, you tried to put something in and solids it wouldn't have solids, it would come straight out the other end. Things wouldn't work. And now we're in its terrible 2 stage. You know, the technology is at a point where it sort of understands the decency of how it needs to walk and talk, and it's a bit clumsy. The technology is quite clumsy, but it's meaningful. So it's not deliberately trying to knock things off the table or put its finger in a PowerPoint. But we have to be mindful that at this point in time, there are certain companies and leaders and thought leaders in the world, and I'm fortunate enough to have some time with Tim Berners-Lee, of course, which was one of the pioneers of the internet. And we all are able to understand that it's the responsibility of the custodians of that technology, the importance of engagement with institutions like QUT, of which we've engaged with in certain parts of cryptography and primitives, that it's a real incumbent responsibility to see not only us as a fast-moving startup, and yes, we're doing some pretty sexy things in the world of blockchain, but it's our responsibility as entrepreneurs and leaders in the space and pioneers that we have to invest the time to educate not only ourselves, but we also have to educate and invest the time within ensuring that we can create the right digital literacy around this technology. How do we get the right level of lexicon? How do we create the manner systems that need to sit within this technology? How do we have that consciousness? And I think there are a number of thought leaders in certainly the blockchain industry that think the same way that we do. But again, I don't think it's spoken enough about. And I think that's the responsibility of us to pull up to pull up the journalists when they like to write Wall Street Journal headlines. We give them a wait and just wait for a moment, let's not get ahead of ourselves.
It's a toddler, but it's going to grow up and we need to help
Look,
it
it has
grow
the
up.
parentage of an Olympic winning genius, right? It's the emergence of Einstein and some of our best gold medalists. But the parentage is there, yet it just needs time.
So Arun, in the preamble, you mentioned this is one of the most important technologies. Would you like to pick up the conversation on blockchain?
I think that there is a lot of hype about blockchain. There's a lot of misunderstanding about blockchain, and also scaling blockchain for the kind of applications is a big technological challenge. But I must tell you one thing, that amidst all this hype, there are a few companies that actually are really, truly working with blockchain and demonstrating how it works, and Leanne's company is one of them. It's one of the true global standouts in blockchain, once you cut through the hype. But being a teacher, let me try to explain why it is actually one of the most profound technologies. I feel that it's the third most important advance in computer science. The Alan Turing's work with a digital computer, and then the TCP/IP protocol for the internet, and the third is the blockchain. Let me just try to tell you what Internet tried to achieve. Internet tried to achieve a very simple thing. In a nuclear war, the US Department of Defense wanted to send information from one computer to the other without knowing which part of the network is going to be surviving. And so they came up with a protocol, the TCP/IP protocol, that broke the files into packets and sent it to, all it did was every computer sent it to the computer it was connected to, and it all got finally assembled by a certain protocol at the end, and it got there. If half the network was blown away, it took more time, but it reached there. It was a great way to take an intermediary away in transferring information from one computer to the other. The problem with this is that when I send a file to you, I still have a copy of the file. It was not suitable for transferring money. It was not suitable for transferring value. The double spend problem. What the genius of Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever it is, so one way to look at blockchain is it is a transfer protocol for value. And you can transfer value from one computer to the other without a trusted intermediary. The whole system itself, by using consensus mechanism and cryptographic proof of work protocol, provides that security. So there are some great things that come out of it. The Bitcoin blockchain is the most immutable, the most safe mechanism to store data in the history of the planet. And every day Bitcoin blockchain continues, it becomes more difficult to, in fact, someone said that if you're going to do an attack on Bitcoin, you will need electricity worth $2 billion just to start reversing the transaction of the last half an hour. $2 billion worth of electricity will be required. It's much easier to break into Fort Knox. So coming back to it, why this is important. This, and as Leanne has demonstrated, the applications, this allows us to digitize things like ownership, registries, things like immutable record of how things are passing, which Everledger is one of the great sort of examples of companies doing provenance. So let's think about, everyone talks about the impact that is having on many of the financial industry and the registries and government applications. Let's look at the traditional world of manufacturing. The traditional world of manufacturing is being disrupted. And if you look at what's happening with additive manufacturing around the world and how quickly it is advancing, it is not a boutique application anymore. Companies like Hewlett-Packard Inc. have now got 3D printers that are able to mass produce 60% of their printer parts, aircraft parts. And additive manufacturing is environmentally more sustainable, because when you do subtractive manufacturing, you start with a material and you chop things off and there's a lot of waste. In additive manufacturing, you only use the material that you need. It also can manufacture things which is just not possible by the current mold technology. In additive manufacturing, you can do that. So what's happening is a world is emerging where manufacturing companies are the ultimate middlemen on the planet. Now think about it. Manufacturing companies are the ultimate middlemen on the planet, and they're being disrupted. So it is not difficult to imagine a world that a company like Hewlett-Packard or other 3D printing manufacturers, and by the way, the 3D printing printers, they can print themselves. So the 3D printing companies are like the Apple, where everyone is a designer. I design a tea kettle. I design a little machine part, like an Apple iTunes store, that my designs can be downloaded. And every time the 3D printer uses my design, using blockchain, a signature is embedded in that copy so it can be tracked forever. And the designer is given a micropayment every time it is actually able to do that. So what you are seeing is a manufacturing world where you have an Apple iTunes kind of store, and blockchain is enabling payment, and also the circular economy about how it goes through the supply chain and how you do that. But guess what? If the manufacturers are going to be disrupted, where does the value go to? The value goes to the designers. And of course, 3D printing companies will make money, but the value also shifts to the raw material producers, because it's the powders that become more important. And guess where powders are? They're in Australia, they're in Commonwealth countries. And it is cheaper to produce powders closest to the mine, because it is cheapest to ship powders rather than raw materials or minerals or finished products. So all the Commonwealth countries and Australia have to do is we make sure we have our power costs are low enough that when this revolution takes place, we are ready to take advantage of it. And I think that's the future. As the manufacturers, the middlemen on the planet are being eliminated, and blockchain will enable that to happen, there is a good story out of it. Are we ready for it? And I think that's the challenge. Because whenever you have these two-sided markets, the middlemen try to capture all the profit. And that's why technology is becoming the new tobacco. You have companies like Google and Facebook that use our personal data and then make all the profits. And we can pick that up as a separate conversation. But that gives you an example of how ICT and additive manufacturing and material science are combining to create new business models.
Fayez, did you want to pick up on a comment?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for that explanation. I think I learned more about blockchain today than I ever had thought I would. So in the same line of simple comments, so I liked your analogy, the baby analogy. So for someone who doesn't know blockchain, my question is, why did you name the baby blockchain? Why not Bob or something?
I can't be famed with the naming of the blockchain. I could be famed with naming Everledger. It was a carton of beer and a good Saturday night. So, but certainly I couldn't name blockchain. But
So
I think
what does that truly stand
so. The name.
for?
I mean, certainly data is stored within blocks,
Yeah.
and they are chained together. So it's a,
That's it?
Yeah.
that's pretty much it.
Okay.
Once it's there, it's there.
Yeah,
It
it's about as
stays, it
simple
remains
as
there.
Australia can get, really.
Okay.
So Faiz, I
Maybe
think,
Satoshi Nakamoto is Australian if they came up with that name.
so Faiz, Arun touched on this convergence issue, but in biology, I noticed on Precision Biosciences website how it sort of brings together the food, the agricultural industries. Could you pick up on that as a theme, and how you see the future playing out in terms of that kind of biological convergence?
Absolutely. The first thing is biological demands are originating from the consumers. So with all the digitization and digital media that's out there, consumers is ever more vocal than the consumer was. And what's happening here in agriculture is the food industry is unable to keep up with the consumer's demands. In the traditional seed industry, which typically took around a decade to come up with a new line or a new trait in X, Y, and Z crop, is basically unable to respond to the consumer demand. So now go back 60, 70 years, the whole green revolution and the whole idea about where we are today is because of monoculture. And monoculture at that point made perfect sense because the world needed to feed a hungry planet. Now that we have a good amount of yields from every crop, the question now is is there nutrition associated with it? So then what we are trying to do at Precision is trying to bridge those gaps. So number one, if there is no new crop or new choices available for these massive companies that produce crackers or cereal or whatnot, the default status is for them to use corn and wheat and make different versions of corn and wheat based products. So you go into a grocery store aisle, and if you say, I'm going to eliminate everything that has wheat in it, the grocery store is pretty much empty, right? So then the question is, how can you expedite the innovations where you bring in novel crops? What's the next quinoa? What's the next, whatever. So at Precision, we are taking a broader look. What we are trying to do is, we are a genome editing company. That means it gives us, our technology allows us to optimize the genomes, right? So optimizing the genome is essentially, we're tweaking the software and making it work for you. And then the faster you can optimize the genome is the sooner you can respond to consumer demand and address immediate problems. So Precision's approach always has been is collecting all the tools that are essential for rapid innovation, meaning starting from a conception of an idea through digitization of the discovery process, and then you immediately take it through genome optimization through genome editing based approaches, and then the next thing is rapid validation, screening, design, build, test kind of an approach, and then take those things and hand it off to those parties within the supply chain who can now multiply or replicate that output and then immediately deliver it to the consumers. So with that, what genome editing has allowed to do, and if you put together computational biology and genome editing together, it compresses the breeding cycle, from an idea or desirable trait to something out in the market, takes it back from about 13 years to 3 to 5 years, and that's huge. And it's that timeline is compressing by the year.
So I'm going to switch gears a bit now and go to you, Tony. Come back to the bionic eye story, because it's kind of almost a miracle. I'm a scientist and always have marveled at at what we do, but where's the future for bionics? And maybe illustrate that with where the bionic, where it's at and where it might go, and when will it be sort of commonly used?
So, perhaps I can start with the history of it, because in fact Australia has a tremendous plays a tremendous role in the whole history of medical bionics. One of the first things that started was actually the heart pacemaker. Little known story, but Tektronix was started here in Australia, and that was incredibly successful. They actually developed the idea of an encapsulated electronics that could then be used in the body, connecting with the heart to make sure that it was actually functioning properly. That technology was then taken up and used by Cochlear for the first cochlear implant. And of course, that was the technology developed over about 30 years ago by Professor Graham Clark in Melbourne. And now the company out of that, Cochlear Limited, has something of the order of about 70% of the world market in cochlear implants. And around about 300,000 people, more than 300,000 people today, have been implanted with that technology. So it's actually a very mature technology. It's been well received. Now we're seeing children being implanted. In Australia, there's sort of screening so that they can get implanted at sort of 6 months and go on to have sort of normal schooling. It's taken quite a long time for that technology to mature to the point where we can put it into the eye. The eye, of course, is moving constantly. The technology needs to be miniaturized, a whole series of sort of technical challenges there. So we did our first prototype study with 3 patients in Melbourne that was very successful. And that as a result of that, they established a company that got venture capital, and they're carrying that forward now into clinical trials. So I think that's a very, very exciting development. We see that really at the start of the road that the cochlear implant was on probably about 20 or 30 years ago. And hopefully that will have the impact that technology has had, but now for people with vision loss. But it really is just the start of this technology. These are the sort of sensory modalities that have failed and that we're trying to replace in people to give them back function that they've lost. What we're looking at now is more central functions to do with the brain and how the brain works, and the idea of having brain-machine interfaces that can give people back the movement of limbs, for example, that people with paraplegia, quadriplegia, to give them back their independence. And I think we're really just at the very start of that technology. What we need to develop there is the ability not only to be able to stimulate the nerves to enable them to regain their function and thereby innovate the muscles that move the body, but also to get the sensory information back in. We call this sort of closing the loop, that you actually want to not only be able to act in the world, but you need to be able to sense the world. You need to be able to get the information back to the brain to be able to control limbs properly and be able to move naturally. So I think we've got a long way to go with doing that. We're at the very start of that journey, and there are huge technical challenges ahead to do that, but I see that as being the pathway forward. And I think we're going to see these technologies being used more and more widely for a wider variety of disability. So I think that's a very, for the future, I think it's a very hopeful story.
Do you think we're on the right trajectory in some of the Commonwealth countries, including Australia?
Yes, look, I think...
Given where we've been and...
That's right. I mean, look, it is a very advanced technology. So in fact, in this stage, it's relatively expensive. It's primarily for people who have severe disadvantage. So for countries like Australia, it does make sense to invest in this because it actually is, particularly if it's conditions that affect children, they can then go on to be productive members of our society and they get enormous benefit from that. But it is relatively expensive, and I think that as the technology matures, it does come down in price and then becomes available to a larger group of people, and also to people who have less severe handicap. It actually addresses a larger volume of potential patients. So I think that's what we're going to see over the coming years, is this technology becoming more available to a wider group of people at a lower cost.
Thanks, Tony. Leon, I want to come back to you. I was reading your bio. These are not secrets because it's all public domain. You know, you were Innovator of the Year 2018 at the Women in IT Awards in London.
And 2016.
And 2016. And you were the IBM champion for 2018, and you're on as you mentioned, on the World Economic Forum blockchain. But the thing that I found most interesting was that you were Business Insider's 26 coolest women in the UK. What does that mean?
It's my pink boots. I didn't
That's
get to
right.
wear them today, but I do have pink boots. I think that's what it was.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, as an entrepreneur working in quite a new industry area, were there challenges along the way that we can share and learn across the Commonwealth particularly? And what messages would you give to others contemplating such a journey?
Extreme challenges, extreme challenges. I mean, I've been largely frustrated by the sort of the lack of consciousness around what is needed in next generation movements. So when I think about the diamond industry, it's 500 years in the making. And so when I first envisioned what was possible in 2015, certainly when I came home, my family looked at me and thought I was nuts. But wind forward to today, and we can proudly say we've tilted the axis of that part of the world or that part of the industry to one side, and now there's public announcements about De Beers investing heavily in the technology and a number of other large mining companies. But one of the biggest sort of frustrations I have felt has been this sort of lack of consciousness around an absolute need to ensure that we can bring next generation technologies and digital standards to the forefront. So, agile governance, how can we bake these technologies together? How can we look at existing sets of frameworks within the diamond industry? The Kimberley process is one of those. The United Nations forward thought in 2003, they brought together a 3-step validation process. We have 81 countries around the world all adhering to an ethical trade of diamonds. Yet everything is still paper-based. I mean, you could go back to the Flintstones, with stone tablets and, with pens and paper. So to a certain extent, that's been a great enabler for us, but it's been a huge frustration as well. And I think that most of the trueness in the work now is starting to form. How do we get digital standards? How can we enable the voices of nerds around the table? Let's bring them there, because I think that that's what we need to get to next. The internet's not going away. These sort of secondary marketplaces are not going away. So let's just bring an acceptance that within the world, this is here. So let's try and form a real focus around not just an emotional intelligence, but a digital intelligence. And how can we bring that not only within the culture of each of our companies or within the education set, but sort of at a wider level? How do we engage at that level? And then beyond that, from a Commonwealth perspective, we have led the charge as the Commonwealth when it comes to sustainability, fairness, anti-slavery, etc. But again, how can we bake that within the triple bottom line that each company has to consciously sort of move towards? And I think Unilever led the charge in that respect, but ultimately that has to sit back with investors having the patience, or even, if you're a publicly listed company, even sort of the wider community to say, look, let's be patient, because let's face it, within the next 20 years, the planet that we knew 20 years ago is not the same planet that we will be living on, in the next generation. So there are a couple of non-blockchain related frustrations. But outside of that, it's a terrible 2-year-old at the moment. We're wrangling it.
It's going to grow up. Arun, we talked about how we contemplate building industries, and I think there's a good case study here in Queensland around the robotics and drones and why big industry and startups might happen in an ecosystem. I think this is something we can share with other Commonwealth nations, because we all have an interest in how we build economies. Can you, because you've been close to this, can you recount what happened in Queensland?
Yeah, I think we all have to look at our competitive advantage. Everyone wants to become Silicon Valley, and it's not going to happen. So if you look at where technology-enabled innovation has happened, you often combine technological capability with certain domain knowledge or content knowledge that those societies are very good in. And I always make the example that fintech didn't actually start in Silicon Valley. It didn't start in New York because Silicon Valley didn't have the financial sector domain knowledge. New York didn't have a lot of computer science. It had a lot of domain knowledge. it actually started in London in a big way, because University College London had professors in computer science department that were consulting on the street. And as the economy went around fintech, all the computer science graduates of Imperial College and Oxford and Cambridge all came and catapulted it. And now, of course, Silicon Valley is totally into fintech once the thing has been there. Israel became an ag tech hub because they had dry land agricultural domain knowledge, or security tech hub because that was the domain knowledge and the content knowledge they had. So when you can combine the technological capability with what you are good at, you actually have the possibility to do this. So we looked at Queensland and said, okay, what's the competitive advantage of Queensland? There are a lot of competitive advantages. We are 2.5 the size, 2.5 times the size of Texas with 5 million people. It's a very high wage economy. It's a very high wage economy with no community appetite for seasonal migration of labor. The industries in which we have the world's best domain knowledge, mining, agriculture, these are very much labor intensive. We all know about mining workers making $250,000 during a mining boom. We want to become the food bowl for Asia, but we have no community appetite for labor, and half the grain farmers by some account are going to retire in the next 10 years. And what's happening to young people on the farm? They're coming to UQ, QUT, and Griffith and want to become accountants and lawyers. They don't want to work on the farm. So unless we automate the farm, it's not going to happen. Okay? So this is why we started focusing on one of the technologies that is extremely important for Queensland is actually going to be robotics. Robotics that is going to enable the logistics and the mining and the agricultural industry. The other competitive advantage we have is we have 2.5 size the landmass of Texas and only 5 million people. So it's a very sparse region. And it means technologies for overcoming sparsity have a natural business model. And this is why Queensland went into drones. You're on the right side of the politics, you want to keep the alien boats out. You're on the left side of the politics, you want to make sure that any environmental disaster is managed. You are the corporate sector like Enron. You want to monitor your power lines in far north Queensland where there are no people. So it was natural that Queensland became a global hub for drones. And the reason it happened was because the regulatory authorities like CASA were willing to experiment with drones in civilian airspace. And so we talked to Boeing 10 years ago, you can do civilian applications here. And they moved their institute, their Asia Pacific headquarters for drones to Brisbane. And so this is how we all have to look at. We need to look at what is our competitive advantage. What are the technologies that empower us? We will never become a global hub of medical electronics. Netherlands is a global hub for medical electronics because it already has Philips. We're not going to replicate, but we will become a global hub for robotics, for big data analytics using drones, because the use cases and the applications are there. And I hope that we throw in some blockchain somewhere.
Yeah. There will be. So regulatory processes by the government is very important then. And I wanted to ask you, precision bioscience, you're using cutting edge genetic technologies, right? We've been through an era where there was a lot of debate and regulation surrounding GMOs. Are we going to face the same issues, or is it easier to do now that we've had the GM debate?
I think one of the things that we talked about backstage was, what exactly is a GMO and how it's a misnomer. And I think what's happening with genome editing is the challenge for 2050 to produce, twice the amount of food that we produce today with the same amount of land. That's a serious challenge. So then the question is, how can we expedite innovation in agriculture to meet those demands? Because everyone's going to be able to afford everything, but then it's going to be a demand-supply kind of a scenario. Yeah. So from that perspective, there is a good amount of awareness among people as to how technologies can enable change. And so at this point, for genome editing particularly, There's a lot of hype associated with it, but there is also a good amount of promise and demonstrated promise. So the regulatory agencies, and as recently as 2 weeks ago, USDA came out with a position document stating genome editing, according to the agency, which everybody in the field always believed, but again, you need the government to engage in and define policy. So USDA came out and said, according to the agency's perspective, it is nothing but expedited plant breeding, right? So, and there are certain regulations that are in place, and the industry is okay with that. And so what's happening is in Europe, but the problem is different countries are taking different positions, and it's going to be sometime before Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, United States, India, all the major producers come up with a unified regulatory scenario. Europe is going to be, Europe and Japan have the far extreme version where they are going to highly regulate genome editing and genome edited outcomes, whereas US and Canada are going to look at it in a more favorable manner.
Yeah. I'd expect that in a very general sense, if the Commonwealth countries could look to harmonise their regulations around both bio and digital, our citizens will benefit and industries will benefit, and it'll be better for all, particularly encouraging trade and interaction. So I'll leave that thought as something to be...
No, I think that's actually a very important point, because the common law tradition actually provides a foundation for experimentation to happen at Commonwealth level around governance. And we should not sort of ignore this simple fact. And often what happens in the legal systems, and especially like a country like Australia, which, see, you cannot figure out the regulation for everything totally in advance. So the beauty in common law is that it actually is like a fix, a patch. Some judge somewhere in a jurisdiction makes a ruling, and we have a way to go forward. It becomes the precedence unless we figure out that there's a better thing needed and the lawmakers come into it, or the Supreme Court or the High Court makes another judgment. So common law gives you the flexibility of like a software patch every time you need to do that. And I think that's a very profound insight in some ways, that around the governance of these technologies, we should look at collaborating.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks, Arun. We've only got a few minutes to go. I want to actually shift gears a bit. In the books that I read on this, to prepare for this, I read a book by Alec Ross, who's an advisor to Obama on industries of the future, and as I mentioned, Klaus Schwab, who wrote The Fourth Industrial Revolution. They referred to the possibility that we might create a more unequal society, because those of us, mostly in this room, we're engaged with the technology, we understand it, we're in fact leading the change on the technology, but there's an awful lot of people who aren't as engaged, and they're a bit fearful because you hear commentary, we're going to wipe out all these jobs, we're going to do these things. And recently in Korea, one of the universities there announced they're setting up an artificial intelligence weapons manufacturing research institute. So this sort of scares people. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to get thoughts on the panel. Do you think about this in your businesses, and what should we do as a society to maybe better engage the people who feel left out? And what do we say? What are the messages we say?
Okay. Do you want me to go?
Anyone? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I can slot something here. Before answering the question directly, I think that we're missing an element in what we discussed here. In fact, and it's actually a common trap in talking technology and not necessarily stepping back and effectively, again, looking at the necessity elements, for the planet, right? At the Commonwealth scale, what is it really that we need to do to scale efforts and use technologies actually to enable countries other than the developed countries that have the highest budgets, right? So how do you do that? I think that's it's probably, if not more important, equally important to the question of the threat to jobs. But I get to the second question, I think. But that first question is super important, because if you take the example of what we're trying to do, which is using existing technology with smarter software and actually collaborating with partners that can enhance that software, get to a point where everyone on the planet can actually use it. I'll give you one example before I get to the second question. Do you know how many iWatches Apple has sold or will sell this year?
Oh.
20 million. It's a great number for a company that disrupts the wrist and that space, but it's only 20 million wrists. And the prediction is actually 50 million wrists in 2020. Again, it's cool for the company, it's cool for the shareholders, but doesn't fit the bill of the billion citizens we have on the planet, right? So that's what the kind of gap we have between Silicon Valley and technologies and the actual impact to society. So I think that's really where I wanted to say something on this. On the job situation, I think globally, and the threat of technology to automation and all these things, I hold my breath on this. I don't know if you would agree, guys, but I'm highly confident that if we design and we co-design actually well the future, and that's probably a good lead into collaboration, we should be able to avoid the dramatic situation of actually, losing jobs at a large scale. So for me, in my opinion, it's a question of design, and it's intense collaboration to really avoid that.
I could probably give you a positive spin.
There may be a question of communication, not
Yeah.
just design. Yeah.
So it was in this building in December last year. Australia was the chair of the Kimberley process, which of course is the validation that sits across 81 countries. And it was in this building in December that I sat and witnessed Australia leading the charge to recognise that there are certain nations within the world that if these new and emerging technologies are becoming adopted by industry, that it's very clear that some of the African nations, whether it be Cameroon or Lesotho or even Botswana, that there isn't sufficient resources, education, and even technical prowess to enable them to easily adopt this technology within the next 2 to 5 years. So Australia, as the chair, led the charge to say two things. Firstly, as an industry, we must ensure that there is complete procedural fairness in terms of ensuring that these countries are able to lean in to this technology. And it was a decision that was made by the lead of not just only Australia, but mostly the Commonwealth nations, that said, we put our hand up and we will help to enable that to happen through the use of resources and aid and et cetera and education. And the second thing that they did in leading the charge is that they said, we made a mistake. When we first formed the Kimberley process, we looked at the definition of conflict as purely being zones that of course are in conflict through arms. But we didn't necessarily look at what is the issue now around anti-slavery and child forced labour in some of those mines. And so again, they actually stood up with the help of the African nations and said, now it's time for us to redefine what it means to be conflict-free. And so that's probably a positive spin. So I think it is. It doesn't have to be led by governments. It can be led by a collective mind, or it can be led by the Commonwealth.
So I would love to continue this conversation. It's late in the day, and I'm getting all these hand signals from the side. So I think that means we've done our DASH panel. So let me firstly thank the panel members, and we'll come back to that. But I so want to thank the audience for staying the distance with us. This is the final session. I think after this there's a wrap-up and drink. So can I ask you to put your hands together for a great panel discussion? Thank you. And Madonna, I guess over to you.
Thank you, and what a terrific panel and a terrific discussion that could have gone on longer. It's just that it is Friday night.
Yep.
We have promised drinks and nibbles, haven't we? So thank you, Peter, for leading that final discussion. And ending it with just the disruption faced by our industries. I love the innovation of rechristening blockchain Bob. I reckon that could actually catch up. We have a driver's hat for each of you before we officially close the afternoon's events and Mario takes us through what happens next. If I could get you to stand up so we can make this as short as possible, walk to the front of the stage, keep your hat on, big smile for the camera. That's a big smile. Ron, you can do it. Smile. Hat in the air. A drover's dream. Thank you, and if I can ask you to exit here, and we'll bring this to a close very shortly. So if you were here yesterday morning, I hope you also enjoyed the tone set for the Commonwealth Innovation Forum 2018 by the Prime Minister of Malta, Dr. Joseph Muscat. Innovation is not the stuff of labs, he said, although probably slightly more eloquently. It required us to listen to the needs of people. It required ideas and collaboration. That word we heard so often. Innovation, he said, should always lead to improvement. Dr. Alan Finkel, the Australian chief scientist, kept that going, talking about the environment in which innovation occurs and how success was the child of collaboration. He drew that together through 4 key pillars: aspiration, education, science and technology, and data. And without that, he reminded us, our athletes up the road on our beautiful Gold Coast would still be racing today in leather sandals. Our panel discussions have been wonderful in building and colouring those plenary talks. From quotas to breastfeeding in public, our first one looked at the definition of innovation, what sort of personality makes a good innovator. And my takeout is that if you were sent out of the classroom for talking and misbehaviour, you stand a good chance of being a good innovator. But we also looked at the big obstacles, particularly as they relate to women. And I wished it was more optimistic, but our top innovators reiterated the findings of a UN report last year, which found women face a multitude of barriers that results in the persistence and sometimes growing gender gaps. As a result, innovations are unlikely to be available on time and at scale to address the needs of women. That's the UN. Transformative results no doubt require private and public sector partners to come together to address those barriers in an integrated manner. And that is itself the definition of innovation. But it also requires innovators, universities and governments to be able to tell their story, to craft a narrative around what they do and how it can fundamentally change people's lives. Thanks to Dr. Margaret Karamboo there and the simple story of her daughter, a dentist, explaining a root canal. We ended yesterday with Heather Bone's facilitation of a panel looking to make our lives and our environment cleaner, safer and healthier. And we heard more on that from Paul Greenfield this afternoon, the 12-year-old worried about crocodiles in the Brisbane River. That pursuit of a better world is at the heart of the innovation that is going on in many of our countries and why each of us is here this week. This morning, Stephen Wellink's panel explored the world in innovation, from the barriers gender equality kept popping up to the need for good education and good educators, and to the role of universities in this space. Do we all need to be a bit more outward looking to envelop social media because our customers, clients and patients are doing that? But his panellists made the point that while that brings with it awesome opportunities, it also carries enormous challenges. You then met Matt Ames, so eloquently talking about the need to stop bugs and, just as importantly, restoring people's functions. But it was also his ability to communicate, to tell us why we sometimes take the most basic things for granted, that hit the chord with me. as did the need and the passion behind feeding the people of the world. The complexity of that issue is really not understood, I suspect, and Professor Sagadevan Mundry's panel illustrated that with several examples, as did Professor James Dale and his banana case study. Our focus hasn't been on problems all the time, though, a recognition that success comes from allowing some failure and keeping it real in a way Lord Marland of Odstock did. And thank you, Lord Marland, for the generosity of your time and comments and in anticipation of the message you will deliver to business in London next week. So many good ideas have popped up, from the fridge that tells you what expires in 24 hours to a suggestion on Dr. Hakamyadi's panel that each country focus on a particular area of health. England might take control of cancer, for example, Australia something else. So how would I sum up the past couple of days? Jim Lane mentioned the P's. Given it's the Commonwealth, I thought I'd go with the 4 C's: creativity, collaboration, consultation, and communication. Thank you for allowing me to be part of it. Thank you again to Destination Queensland and Virgin Australia. And to close our conference and to look at where we go from here, please join me in welcoming the CEO of Life Sciences Queensland and the convener of the Commonwealth Innovation Forum 2018, Mario Panisi. Thank you.
Well, we've reached that time of the program where I say thank you to everybody, but let me start by saying thank you, first of all, to Madonna, who's just saved me having to summarise everything. Wonderful. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that Madonna has done a wonderful job, but not least of which with that summary just then. But she's kept everybody well engaged, and she's pretty much kept us to time, notwithstanding some of the panellists who thought they might go a little longer. So Madonna, thank you for your enthusiasm to be part of this, and thank you for the way in which you have made this happen. I suspect a little drink later tonight will probably not go astray, so please, everybody, please thank Madonna.
Thank you.
So I certainly won't try to recap what's happened over the last day and a half. Madonna's done a wonderful job of that, and for those of you who've been on us for the last day or so, you'll see we've covered a lot of ground and a lot of important issues have been ventilated. And it was well and good to have that chat, but the important thing is not the chat that we've just had, it's what we do with that information. And Madonna has already alluded to, and some of the speakers have already alluded to the fact that that CHOGM is on at the end of next week, and the Commonwealth Business Forum will be part of CHOGM, and very fortunately, I've been invited to participate in that, as has Peter Riddles, who was just on that panel, as has Minister Dick. So there will be a number of us who will take some of the lessons of this past day and a half, and we will ventilate them to that bigger forum. But the way that we will be able to ventilate those arguments and those opportunities will be with partners, because collaboration is what will actually help us achieve anything. And I'm very pleased that Lord Marland is still here with us. And Lord Marland, if you may come forward, you like our twin look?
Fair dinkum.
Fair dinkum. Lord Marland has been a great CWIC, and Lord Marland in particular have been great supporters of this initiative. They thought we were a little bold, a little organisation here in Antipodes, decided to run an event to engage the Commonwealth. But I'm very pleased in discussions that I've had since I met Lord Marland some months ago, that CWIC is very keen to work with Life Sciences Queensland to actually give this event a future and a life. So the Commonwealth Business Forum next week will be the first step in that journey, and be I be so bold to say that this won't be the last Commonwealth Innovation Forum, Lord Marland.
Well, Mario, congratulations on everything. I listened just to that last panel. I think I learned so much, and I'm at my age to learn things is really wonderful, terrific. And we need to carry out this message across the Commonwealth as you were doing here, but it needs to go to a wider audience. Don't come next week for the Commonwealth Enterprise Investment Council Business Forum or CHOGM, because it's the week after.
But I will come
Starts
next week.
on the, well, you're always welcome, of course. It starts on the 16th of April. A lot of these ideas you have created today will be fed into that and are incredibly valuable. And as you say, the most important thing is not to stop here. So we're trying to persuade, and I think we are persuading the Government of Queensland to invest in a Commonwealth development, not just this particular innovation forum, but other things we can do for the state of Queensland. Queensland are strategic partners of our organisation, and we're proud to serve and work with them and have a first-class working relationship with them. So this is just the start, I hope, of what we can achieve together. And Mario, I want to thank you on behalf of the Commonwealth, not that I'm entitled to thank you on behalf of the Commonwealth, but if the whole Commonwealth was here, they would thank you. I particularly want to thank those that have spoken, and I've had the privilege of listening to, and indeed, privilege is the word, because the quality was phenomenal. And you are welcome at any time to any Commonwealth event. And look forward to seeing you again as we create this snowball, which is now really starting to move. I'm sorry, just on the subject, so well, we only started this organisation 3.5 years ago. Already we've got the Saudi government wanting to work with us. We've got 60 strategic partners across the world. We are opening offices we have opened an office in Nigeria and Malaysia. And so our organisation is going forward, which the Commonwealth, incidentally, hasn't done for a very long time. This is Opportunity Commonwealth. Like any organisation, it's only good as the people who are members of it and the people who commit to it. I always say it's a bit like being a member of a gym or a golf club. If you don't use the gym, you don't want to work out, and you don't want to socialise in the gym, you won't end up being a member of it or participating on it. What I thought today showed was that there are so many talented people across these 53 nations, all of which want to invest in the Commonwealth and prepared to give of their time to make this unbelievable soft power organisation work. And I want to thank you, all of you, for the contributions you've made on behalf of the Commonwealth. But Mario, I want to thank you so much for putting on this great event. It's a phenomenal achievement.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Marlin. Thank you for those kind words, Lord Marlin. I'll take my hat off to you as well. I will speak further to that in a moment, but before I do that, Lord Marlin, I'd like to provide you with a Commonwealth Games baton. This is actually there'll be a team running around without a baton, maybe the English team, because you've got their baton. As a symbol of passing the baton, as it were, to CWIC, and I look forward very much to the next time we get together in a Commonwealth Innovation Forum. So please display this with pride and as a reminder of your time here in Queensland. Thank you.